But now the European bring this new concept based in his lower self of individuality, and now we buy into that individuality because we want to be like the European, because we think that if we become like the European, somewhere he'll find the kindness in his heart to accept us as equal, as one of his own kind. And it will never happen. So we are dedicated here at the Moorish Science Temple of America to debunking all of these false notions, to re-educate our people with the right knowledge, with the truth. The truth will not only set you free, it will make you free. And so today we have a young man all the way from New York City, Temple 82 in New York, Brooklyn, New York, to be more precise. He is coming today to bring us some information that is going to raise our consciousness and our understanding of this European system that we live under right now. He's going to give us some information about our Constitution and about our economic situation here in America that is going to give us a whole new insight on how to operate within this governmental structure. So without further ado, and because he has so much information that he wants to share with us. You know, this brother told me, he said, I'll be here for a while. He said, I will give you as much as I can give you. This is what he said, unselfishly, I will give you as much as I can give you. So without further ado, I bring to you a young man who is destined to make great strides in this national and divine movement. I bring to you at this time the noble Tafir Uriel Bey. Please welcome him with a hearty hand and a hearty Islam.
Islam, everyone. Islam. I'm not going to take too much of your time. I just want to feedback here. I'm just going to go over some things we talked about the other night, particularly, as the brother mentioned, concerning Constitution or the constitutional law, about procedures of law, or more specifically how many of the said courts or Union States courts have been and are functioning unconstitutionally, as you well know. And we'll be discussing some things concerning the issue of taxation or taxes and the unconstitutionality of that. Because the Internal Revenue Service, which is what I refer to as a syndicate, long-arm debt collection agency for the international bankers, has no right, no authority, no constitutional authority, that is, to impose, to fatigue, or burden the people of the United States for any type of tax, levy, toll, etc. All right? So we need to get an understanding of exactly who they are and where they get their authority, if any at all. But I will start by saying, again, all praises to Allah, great God of the universe, and I give honor to the Prophet Noble Ali, our divine and illustrious Prophet. And I give honor to our national flag, seal, and Constitution, for which I pledge allegiance to as a citizen in the United States, not of, but in, and a United States citizen, Moorish American. Because if we have a United States Constitution, we therefore have we are United States citizens, for those of us who are truly citizens within the constitutional fold. All right? I just want to say, so it's not a thing of me just standing up here preaching to you or whatever the case might be. If you have any questions at any time and you feel as though I'm going too fast, feel free to, raise your hand, nod your head or something, and I'll be glad to go over any of the information with no problem. All right? So, I talked about the bankruptcy of 1930, 1933, which, as you know, is paramount in the issue of understanding what has been going on. And for those of you who weren't here or may not have come across any of the information, I'm just going to go over that very quickly. For those of you who were here, just bear with me for a minute and I'll get through it as quickly as possible. As I mentioned, the bankruptcy of 1930, and particularly 1933, which was declared by said President Roosevelt at the time, under Executive Orders 6073, 6102, 6111, and 6260, basically was stating that there was a so-called existing national emergency and an economic emergency more specifically, and so therefore they felt it was necessary to declare some new kind of policy, public policy, which has nothing to do with the Constitution. All right? And they even went on to say in the House Joint Resolution 192, and you can check it out for yourself, 73rd Congress, first session, they went on to say that the, that the Constitution or Congress's fiduciary obligation or constitutional obligation it created a problem for them to carry out this public policy, or it was contrary to the public policy, which of course is constitutional heresy. That's heresy, all right? But again, like I said, you can check out the Joint Resolution, a House of Joint Resolution 192, 73rd Congress, first session. I also wanted to mention, when I talked about Senate Report number 93-549, which came out in 1973, and the Justice Department, of course, is talking about these existing emergencies, 4 existing emergencies of which are still standing. That is also referred to as, or you might be able to find that in the library under the Summary of Emergency Power Statute. All right? And so if you can't find it under the 93rd Congress, first session, 1973, or Senate Report number 93-549, you will find the Summary of Emergency Power Statute. It is some 600 pages long, but I want you to pay careful attention or specific attention to pages 187 and 594, 596, and 597. Those particular pages talk about, as I mentioned the other night, Nixon's national emergency, of which he declared by proclamations in 1970, March 28, 1970, and August 15, 1971, where, as I said, in March 28, 1970, it was specifically because of the strike, or the postal strike, against the said government, and in which he declared the non-convertible dollars into gold. But that was only done for a few seconds. So in other words, they had, in a sense, lifted the order or the decree that they would have a national emergency or an ongoing national emergency only for a short time. And then it was thereafter reiterated under Public Law 93-110. Okay? Are there any questions before I go any further? You want me to slow down? I can jot it down on the board if you'd like, for those of you who have missed any of the information. But I want to go on to say that, as I said, all of this played a very important role or part in the taxation process, all right? And when we talk about taxation, we have to talk about who is subject and who isn't. Now, I know that as a United States citizen, the people of the United States in the constitutional fold, I am in no way, nor will I ever be, subject to taxes or paying taxes of any kind to the European colonial settler. All right? Because let's get an understanding. When he did what he did in 1930, 33, around that time, and thereafter changed the procedures of law to procedures of equity, as I mentioned the other night, with the Erie Railroad versus Tompkins case, all right, which changed the standing precedence of 150 years of constitutional law, or said common law. Well, at that point, he became a squatter. Now, you know and I know that the government, said federal government, state, whatever, they have no problems with having the courts, the marshals, and whomever get you out of a place if they feel that you have no right to be there, right? So if that is the case, well then, I pose this question to you. Well, if you know, based on documentary evidence, that you have somebody sitting in your house, in your palace, whether it's the White House, whether it's wherever, well then, what must he be? He's got to be a squatter, right? So now, my solution to that is to learn your law as the people of this continent to have this guy evicted. I'm sorry, you know what I mean? It's time for him to go back to Europe from whence he came. The prophet said himself, he said, now is the time for every man to worship under his own vine and fig tree, right? So now, if he's from Europe or wherever he's from, whatever galaxy or wherever, well then that only means that his divine rights are somewhere else, not here. So, we really need to understand this. We need to understand more about our divine rights, our unalienable rights, of which are rights that are above those of an alien. That's what unalienable means. And don't get it confused with inalienable. Inalienable only means those rights that are granted to you by Congress or the said federal government, of which, just for the record, as I mentioned the other night, there is no such thing as federal anything in the Constitution. Let's get an understanding. So when they start talking about the Internal Revenue Code and this federal statute and that federal statute, ain't got nothing to do with the Constitution. I don't care how much constitutional authority they say they have as per the 16th Amendment, which is unconstitutional, was never lawfully or so-called legally ratified, all right? And as some of you well know, that the only amendments, if you will, that are lawful are the first 10, which in the inner circles are referred to as the 10 Commandments, as quiet as it's kept. All right? So, where they talk about they have a right to, you know, tax on income, etc., you're fine. But that's only for corporate privileges. I am not a corporation. I'm not an artificial entity, nor will I ever be artificial. All right? And if they say or claim that I am, well then the burden of proof is on them. Right? The burden of proof is always on the accuser. Annus quod erat demonstrandum, which is the Latin for burden of proof. All right? So, again, as I said, that the burden of proof is on them. They have an obligation to prove that I have one. All right? And speaking of obligations, I'm sorry. What is it, brother?
Okay, the question I wanted to ask, okay, so basically what you're saying, is that the reason why they always want people to incorporate when they do business or whatever, instead of being a single entity?
Precisely. Yes. Yes, incorporation by every and any stretch of the imagination is the order of the day. And once you have incorporated or have been assumed or presumed to be that, well then, certainly they can do whatever it is that they please to what is construed to be their property. All right? But I know that, as I said, and as I will continue to say, as the Constitution states, that the enumeration of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. And that's me, and those like me. That's all, that's simple, all right? So they can quote this code, that code, Title 26 of the United States Code, which is non-positive law or unconstitutional law. And so I'm not getting into, again, any arguments about the particulars of those codes. But if I were to, well, make no mistake, I can put them on the spot. But again, my main concern is the Constitution. And that should be your main concern. All right? I will stress this and continually stress this. Yes?
Okay, you said you could put them on the spot, okay, when they go serving them codes, how do you go about doing that?
Well,
I was saying you saying you put them on the spot when they go to serving them codes, how do you go about doing that?
okay. Well, again, the litmus test, if you will, is the Constitution. My question would be, what constitutional authority do you have? There's Supreme Court ruling. Brushaber versus Union Pacific Company, if I'm not mistaken, in 1916, which talked about the income tax being an indirect excise tax, right? It's an indirect excise tax, so if it's indirect, that means it's for something artificial, all right? Not directly. So that is the only so-called constitutional authority that they say they have or claim to have, right? And the 16th Amendment gave them no new power. And again, this is all based on the so-called proclamations and said national emergency, an economic emergency. But it was never really an economic emergency for us. It only became that under the incapacity of servitude and the slave mentality of which we had at the time, and not knowing who we were, and clinging to all of those things that deluded to slavery, and chasing after the false gods of Europe of whom we knew nothing of. You see? So that's why it is paramount that those of you who haven't proclaimed your nationality to do so. But again, as I said, the Internal Revenue Service, just for the record, has anyone ever asked the question, well, why do they call themselves the Internal Revenue Service rather than the Bureau of Internal Revenue? Only because they have entered into a service agreement. That agreement is to what? Serve someone else. If you doubt the validity of what I say, check it out. You can find it in, again, Public Law 94-564, where this service agreement that they entered into was with the governor of the fund, the said Secretary of the Treasury of the said United States. All right? Where the Secretary of the Treasury, governor of the fund, basically was the individual who was appointed as a receiver in bankruptcy, and was also delegated and conferred powers to issue licenses, etc., to various agencies, again for the sole purpose of dealing with the said economic emergency. Right? So all of the proclamations, wartime powers, etc., came under this emergency, or came under the executive orders, etc. And if you read the executive orders, you will find this to be true. But again, just for the record, the Internal Revenue Service is also in an agreement with an agency known as the Agency for International Development, which is a paramilitary organization. Yes. who is working in criminal conformity with the International Organization of Police, or the Organization of International Police. I'm not too certain of that, but you can look in Title 22, United States Code Annotated, which you can find in any library, and you will see proof of the fact that they have entered into this agreement, all right, which they are all international agencies that collect data or information for the bankers. Yes.
What's the group called again?
The group is called, if I'm not mistaken, they're called the Agency for International Development. That's the first group, which entered into an agreement with the governor of the fund and the Internal Revenue Service. All right, and again, like I said, they are essentially information service employees. Organization.
What's the IRS do?
They collect data, information, etc. via the forms you fill out, right? The so-called instruments, which are all regulated under the, as many of you know, the UCC codes, or what I refer to as the unconstitutional concept of criminality.
And what do they do with the data?
Well, again, that data is given to the bankers. And the bankers, in other words, it's much like the accounting system that they have. They have an accounting system which works with the General Accounting Office, where the comptroller of the currency of each state makes a report of how much money is in circulation, what kind of debt is out there, what kind of credit is out there. This is why you have many of the courts who collect revenue. Every time you turn around, they're talking about, well, that'll be a $20,000 fine or a $5 fine or whatever, right? So they're collecting revenue and data along with that, all right? And unfortunately, what many of us do time and time again, we have a tendency and a propensity to give consent. And I am not giving consent to anyone for anything, for any reason. We're unconscious. Now, if somebody bopped me in the head and, and I'm stumbling around or something, then yeah, okay, fine. All right? This is why, I'm sorry, brother. Islam.
I want to ask you, okay, being that this is, the spirit of this is true, but, the prophet said he came to bring us into the mainstream of international affairs.
Now, presently, all these artificial entities are the ones that's controlling, apparently, international affairs. And being a Moor who trying to get into business, trying to access funds, so that you can do the work of uplifting fallen humanity. If the Moors don't have these institutions in place to support that, it kind of puts you in between the rock and the hard place as far as knowing what the truth is, what your rights is, but seeing that they have all the funds, things like nonprofit agencies or what have you. Do you have any thoughts on that, or, as far as, again, the Moors don't have things in place wherever I can go by and submit a proposal and get funding for my idea, whereas the European presently do. So okay, do I not deal with him and don't do nothing because I be giving up my rights, or, you know what I'm saying? That the kind of rock and the hard place you be between in trying to actually manifest the work, whereas in standing on the principle. I hope you understand. Peace.
In answer to your question, I will say this, and I will continue to reiterate this. Learn the law, keep the law, enforce the law, and all other things shall be added on to you. All right? And you having a better understanding or comprehension of the constitutional law, because you do have an obligation. that obligation is to your foremothers and forefathers to uphold that law. He has an obligation. That obligation is to, he has an obligation of office, but more importantly, it's to the people. And until such time that you take a stand and say, listen, all right, things are the way they are, and I understand that I'm dealing with this fraudulent debt fiat currency, right, and everything that comes along with it, the unconstitutional procedures of law which run parallel with it, fine. However, that does not negate the fact that in the interim stage, or interim stage, that I will do my job. And make no mistake, I'm not painting any false pictures or anything like that. I understand you have to eat. I understand you got to pay bills and all of that. But now let's look at who you are paying your bills to, primarily, ultimately, to someone, again, who is a squatter, who is a settler, and has no right to be here. So I'm not saying this from the place or part of hate or anger, because, again, my job and my mission, as yours is, if you claim to be a Moorish American, is to do that in love. But it doesn't say that I don't have a responsibility or an obligation to let him know in love that, listen, you can't be here. It is time for you to go. All right? So, again, like I said, when I talked about the Social Security situation the other night, which, as we said and as we know, was created for the sole purpose of purportedly dealing with the economic emergency, of which, interestingly enough, the Social Security Administration was operating and is operating under something known as the Declaration of Interdependence, all right, which came about January 22nd, 1937, which can be found in a book known as the Book of the States, all right? The Book of the States, the Declaration of Interdependence. That was the first of two. There was another one that came about in 1976, of which Marjorie S. Holt, a congresswoman, in the extension of remarks in the Congressional Record of January 19th, 1976, talked about the communist precepts, principles, etc., of these international organizations and what they were trying to do. Because every now and then, you will get a European who will tell. Call it divine law, divine intervention, whatever you want to call it, but they'll tell on themselves. All right? Yes? Yes, it's the Congressional Record of January 19th, 1976 through January 27th, 1976, of which in the Congressional Record of January 27th, 1976, you'll find Ron Paul, who was a congressman, talked about the conversion of over $27 billion of gold, the people's gold, which was converted and sold, and a great deal of it was also auctioned. That's right, auctioned. The same way that they were auctioning many of us. All right? But, be that as it may, as I said, and still not to get away from your question, because it is an important question. And as I said, I understand we have to take care of our families. All right? But that doesn't say that in the meantime, in the interim again, that you cannot learn your law and execute your law. All right, I hope that I've answered your question to some extent or some degree. Were there any other questions before I go any further? All right, very good. So, again, we now understand, at least I think we understand, or I'd like to think we understand, who the Internal Revenue Service is, which is, as far as I'm concerned, no one, nobody, and nothing. All right? Because I am the only real, substantive being, and those like me, that are, again, real. And I will go on to say that the European slave, subject, colonial settler is a figment of my imagination. And until such time we all collectively get that in our heads, we are doomed. All right? That is why we said, even during the time after the war, or post-bellum, as opposed to antebellum, before the war, but even after the war, when we were supposedly defeated, etc., you have to understand that, in all honor to our foremothers and forefathers, because they had the divine instruction and the knowledge and the intellect to know how to out-trick a trickster. And they understood the nature of a thing. And I say that because they conned this guy. They did. They conned him. A good con, the best con that ever was, conned him into signing an agreement that he was later going to have to face or deal with. But how would that be so, or how would that be the case? That meant that, and they knew, much like the prophet knew, he said that this knowledge or information, to paraphrase him, is for the third and fourth generations, right? As our foremothers and forefathers knew in the said 1700s, or the 18th century. They knew what he was going to do. And they knew that this would be the time when you guys would start waking up and questioning things. I mean, think about it. 35, 40 years, any of us in any of the said courts would be standing up there talking about, I don't know. All right, but now, when we win or lose the case, or so-called lose, everyone is now questioning, what jurisdiction do you have? What written affirmation of authority that is beyond and or above the Constitution, the supreme law of the land? All right? And anything to the contrary of due process of law, as pursuant to the Fifth Amendment, is notwithstanding. So whenever any of these so-called federal regulations, whether it be in the airports, whether it be communications on the radio, whatever, tell you, well, you can't say or do, what? You must be crazy. Because all of my unalienable rights, again, are retained by me, fully intact. Now, even though, yes, I know a lot of people are running around talking about First Amendment rights, this, that, and the other, they don't know what they're talking about, because all their rights have been statutized into commerce. And as we know, statue means artificial, right? A likeness of something. So that's why I say, I mean, I can say with a de jure certainty, a constitutional de jure certainty, or legal or lawful certainty, that I have these rights of which cannot be denied or disparaged, cannot be taken away, cannot be abrogated. There is no amendment, has been, will never be, as far as I'm concerned, save for when the people decide, that can abolish, suspend, abrogate, or the like of any of the constitutional mandates, provisions, or prohibitions. Namely, habeas corpus. Right? Where the state or the said federal government or whomever is holding the said prisoner in captivity or has kidnapped you. Right? But that kidnapping does not necessarily have to be physical. And if you do the research and you look under something known as corpus juris secundum, 39, section 39A, it goes on to talk about restraints against a citizen's liberties. And that, mind you, that societas, or society, or the confederation, namely us, determine what is intolerable restraint. We have the final say, we have the final jurisdiction. And when you write a writ of petition of and or for habeas corpus, that is a decree or an order wherein and whereby you are ordering the court to say, and the magistrate to say, to pass through, if you will, that particular order or petition. All right? And you are ordering them to notify the respondent and to question the respondent why they are holding this citizen in captivity. This also means IRS agents. This means any said federal agent. Because you are indicating who that person, and I emphasize person, artificial entity is, that is or who is restraining you. So don't let any of these magistrates tell you, whether it be in writing or other, that, listen, that only applies in situations where you have a Mumia Abu Jamal kind of thing or situation. No. No, no, no. Anytime, any situation, for any reason. Don't believe me, check it out, look it up, you will see it for yourself. And that the writ of habeas corpus, right, in Corpus Juris Secundum, section 179, says that it is a paramount writ above any and all other writs, and is also in, Corpus Juris Secundum, section 39, if I'm not mistaken, goes on to talk about it being a constitutional and or said common law writ, which is a prerogative writ. So now, as Bobby Brown would say, it's my prerogative. Well then, it is my prerogative, the people's prerogative, to execute that writ when he or she feels it is necessary. So it is optimally important for you to understand, to know, that he has no authority through any of his long-arm debt collection agencies, syndicate, long-arm, has no authority whatsoever at any time for any reason to order you around. Unless, of course, you don't say anything, because silence is consent. You have the right to remain silent, and anything you say can and will be used against you or held up against you in a court of law. Well, no, I'm not going to remain silent. And any and everything I say will be lawful and legal as in accord or pursuant to that Constitution and any other law that the people of the United States have made in conformity with that or concomitant to. So, are there any other questions? Yes. Certainly. I'm sorry. Through instruments, documents, contracts, or the like, as many of you already know, some of you may not know, whether it be driver's license and whatever else. And it's not to say that for those of you who say, well, listen, I don't want to create or cause any confusion, and I don't want to appear to be a rebel and this, that, and the other, so I'm going to go get the license and whatever else. But remember, as to what I said the other night, that license, or a true license, is a liberty. And if someone is granting you a liberty, then you can't be who it is you claim to be. However, for those of you that wish to drive around with the licenses or whatever, you have remedies at law. And I said at law. That means constitutionally that you can use, right? So that, understand that yes, they are going to proceed and operate under what they believe to be law, this, that, and the other, penal codes, etc., which are, mind you, in Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, considered to be bills of attainder, or ex post facto law. Which means, again, after the fact. All right? And so the people never consented to any of these penal codes. Right? So, therefore, That's all they're operating under, the said police department, etc., but not getting away from your question. Again, through all of these, and understand that any application that you fill out, and notice I say application as is used throughout this system, application only means to apply, which means to beg, beseech, plead, right? And many of you know about that plead thing. I plead guilty, I plead not guilty, or whatever. And I'm not asking please about anything. I either qualify or I don't qualify. And as far as I'm concerned, as a constitutional citizen of the continental United States, I qualify. And am qualified. So, again, these particular contracts or instruments, all under the said Uniform Commercial Code, which was created by the National Conference of Commissioners on Uniform State Laws and the American Law Institute, which are all members of the American Bar Association. Now, they become a part of a bar association, yes, take a bar exam. So now, how is it that they are qualified to enforce the law? How? So notice they say attorney at law. So how can you be an attorney at law when we said and we know that attorney means fiction of law? So how can you be a fiction at law, or constitutionally speaking, unless it is an oxymoron? And I'm a more, not a moron. All right? So, again, it is considered to be a privilege or title of nobility of which they've granted themselves, and immunities and privileges, etc., as per them hodgepodging the law, as I mentioned the other day, to blend all of the procedures of law into one form of action or one form of pleading, which again, I am not pleading, so therefore I'm not in that mix.
In reference to the Internal Revenue, you mentioned bill of attainder. I'd like you to elaborate on that a little, but my question is, what is the circumstance, I just asked to give you the situation, what is the circumstance when Internal Revenue goes into one bank account and removes whatever money they think is necessary to satisfy their debt? To me, that is total invasion of privacy, and something should be illegal about that.
Well, understand, it's illegal because everything that they are doing is, for all intent and purpose, illegal. However, it becomes legal by virtue of, again, your consent. Again, when you entered into the contract to open up the account and you gave the Social Security number, right, that meant that you consented, wherein you didn't indicate in writing or at any time that, well, listen, I'm doing this under protest, or until such time that a tax liability or whatever can be determined, all right? And not to mention, I don't have to even give you a Social Security number to open up an account, if I so desire, right? Now, we talk about privacy. Well, then all of my rights, privacy, etc., as pursuant to but not limited to the Fourth and Fifth Amendments, are fully retained by me and intact. That's simple. I mean, even their Fraudulent Privacy Act of 1974, right? Section 552, I think it's B or something like that, goes on to talk about, well, your privacy or constitutional freedoms, etc. And as to why you don't have to comply to any of these rules, regulations, which again, as I said, are decrees of council. But whose council? Again, the National Council of Commissioners on Uniform State Laws, of which became uniform throughout the said 50 states, because there are no states, as we know, there are only 13 colonies, because until such time that the Constitution is truly abolished or the like, the 13 colonies are that and only that and will never be beyond that, right? Which you have 13 four-corner square, boxed in, Caucasian, caught in or caught and caged in. All right? So, again, my divine rights, my supreme rights, my national rights, my inalienable rights are all intact and aren't going anywhere. All right? And I am, and I consider myself to be, as those of you, sons, filias, and mothers, genatrikis, or genatrix, all right, are the true nobles and nobility of the high Moorish nobility here in the continental United States. And there is nothing above that. Know this. You must know this. You must know this. All right? And I just want to say, you know, I was doing, going over some information, reading some so-called historical facts about Roman history or ancient Roman history, where they talk about the first families of Rome. And they, according to the European time clock, this is 25 centuries ago they're talking about. Well, as many of us know, 25 centuries ago, I mean, even earlier than that, they were still in caves. So how could they be talking about first families, anything? The reason why I say that, because first family, when we talk about first families, we're talking about birthrights. We're talking about bloodline. We're talking about inheritance. All right? And the only nobles that I know of, and mind you, in this same book, they're referred to as patricians. Patrician or patricias means noble. So the only nobles I know are us. Who, mind you, they were also referred to as Quirites, who had a law prior to the 12 Tables of Rome known as the Quiridian law. And this law, or what they call ius Quiridium, all right? And this law was for the sole purpose of protecting the birthright inheritance of those people, which couldn't have been European. Not some 25 so-called centuries ago, according to his time clock. Couldn't have been. I defy anyone to prove me wrong. And mind you, for further confirmation of this, these patricians were referred to as gentes or genes. Genes coming from the word in Latin genatrix, coming from the mother. Yes, this is where they get the term Gentiles. So when the Jews or so-called Jews call you Gentiles, well, guess what? They're giving you honor. They're saying, in fact, and in truth, that they are bastards, have no land, have no right to anything, anywhere on this planet, truthfully speaking. And the non-gentiles were referred to as plebe or plebe, who were commoners, or the common masses, who, even though they may have prospered financially in similar to what is today a parliamentary system, or under legislative acts, etc., under civil rights and all these other things, well, guess what? They never kept their land or whatever it was too long because they had no family records. They had no proof of their bloodline inheritance. However, much like Negroes today, or commoners today, they are constantly marching and pleading and talking about, we want civil rights or privileges, etc. And what does Congress do? They say, fine, we will now come up with a group of, again, parliamentary enactments, namely the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, of which typified this fraud at best, or a cheap money changer's pirate trick. All right? And in so doing, this was the beginning of the watering down of those laws that dealt with birthright, inheritance, family rights, etc. And we divided the law into two things known as the fas and the boni mores. Fas only means divine right and law, or by the will of Allah. All right? Praikonium Allah. All praises to Allah. But my point is that this not only happened during this time, but if we fast forward into the so-called present, concerning the communist precepts of which developed out of these Negroes, begging the establishment for passing laws or legislation that would give them more rights so that they would have at least what they thought were rights, but in truth weren't, as we well know. It again created problems for those who had true birthrights or had an inheritance that was protected by law, and in our case, constitutional law. This is where we get into the so-called Communist Manifesto, right? That they say Karl Marx wrote, but it was really Clinton Roosevelt. No coincidence, we're talking about a Roosevelt in 1841, 7 years prior to Karl Marx, right? And it was under these principles that the law merchant came into being or was reestablished, right? And why and how the international, or how can I say, the United Nations, and the League of Nations, etc., came up with these laws under the Bretton Woods Agreement that they would have an international monetary fund and all of this to regulate the monetary exchanges. And again, there is no constitutional authority that says that they have a right to do this. Or a bank for reconstruction and development. What is this? What is it? I mean, come on now. We've got to do something about this. I mean, I've heard, and I know you've heard the phrase that the pen is mightier than the sword, right? And sword is nothing but words, which is a high science in which you cast what? Spells. To spell words, to form sentences, to form intelligent thoughts. And what does the prophet say about thought? Right? That's why I know that this movement is divine. That's why I know that here in the Northern Hemisphere, this is where the consciousness is, and where the consciousness lies, or dwells, if you will. All right? But I will, I'm about ready to close, but if there are any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. And if I can answer them, I will answer them to the best of my ability. And if I don't know, I will tell you I simply do not know, and it requires more research on my part. Yes, brother.
And the Constitution don't say all debt should be paid by gold and silver.
Yes, precisely. So now, if we are talking about the Constitution and that this is the only, again, pecuniary medium of exchange, then where did all of this other stuff come from? Where and by whose authority? Wasn't by ours. But they took advantage, as, you know, they have an inclination to do, to take advantage. And that's all right that they did. All right? I'm not condoning it, but I'm saying it's all right in the context of, well, that only, how can I say, would cause us to rise to the occasion. It will or should only sharpen our skills so that we can put them on trial. I have no problem with indicting these individuals because I know that my indictment comes with a divine authority. And speaking about indictments, just for the record, when they arrest you for a so-called arrest, of which happens the minute that they stop you, not when they put you in handcuffs, but point being is, where is the indictment? There has to be an indictment before they take you into custody or kidnap you. This is an ever-present reflection of the mirror image of the law. Flipping the script, or witchcraft, or switchcraft. All right? This is what I want to know in each and every instance where a Moor or Moorish American is kidnapped against their will and without their lawful consent. Brother, you got a question?
From a legal aspect, the Pan American Conference in 1928,
Yes.
Prophet Timothy, the title was a plenipotentiary, just like the title of Secretary of State for the United States. Now, how was he recognized as such from a legal aspect, and who was he representing, and where, how did he do that? Just like the Secretary of State would represent the United States, how was he representing whatever it was he was representing? I'm saying that just in general. But how did he pull that off in reference to being there in that position? And where is the documentation? And how come we're not necessarily operating on such documentation at this point?
Well, a lot of that is, again, as I said before, it is because many of us don't do research, right? Or intense research, or research, period. But for those of us that do, and one of the reasons why you cannot find that, because I have searched for it myself, the Sixth International Conference, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But from what I understand, there is a document called, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, and they even talked about it in high school, but never went into detail, referred to as the Monroe Doctrine, which, from what I understand, makes reference to that. But the prophet, yes, was representing the Moorish nation, or those citizens here and throughout the continent. And I can't purport to know. I can't even begin to imagine how he pulled it off. I'm not on that level yet. But rest assured, I am doing my research. And as I do my research, I'm finding out more and more about what he did and how he did it, and the skill in which he did it. Masterful. Yes, brother. I think you might have to later right here.
Islam.
Islam.
I give honor to Allah and to His holy prophet, noble Ali, reincarnated, for all the wonderful works that He has brought unto us. Now, I have a question as far as what the brother asked. Would it be the affidavit of religious organization that enabled the prophet to go to Havana, Cuba conference to represent a nation? The religious affidavit of organization, would that be the document that enabled him at the outset to go to the Havana, Cuba conference and represent the Moorish nation as a whole at that conference?
I can't say for certain, but I will say, and it's a bit of speculation on my part, that that may have played a part, but I seriously doubt if it was solely reliant on that. Because